After that, you will present the Swedfund's comments on it, and you will talk about and other so to say, reflections on the report, and I will introduce the different speakers as we go along. But please, Stephen, go ahead and start, and we'll listen to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kim, and thank you to EBA and the Ministry for inviting me. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, so as Kim said, my name's Stephen Spratt. It was pointed out to me yesterday that Spratt is a joke in Swedish, which I'm only just realizing, and but I'm told it's a nice joke. It's also a joke in English, but in a slightly different way, probably less nice. Anyway, we're moving on. So yeah, I'm from the Institute of Development Studies, which is at the University of Sussex. We do a variety of, been around since the late 1960s, working on development issues. Lots of varied work going on. I focus on finance and structural change in economies, particularly from a sustainability perspective, but investment generally. And in recent years, quite a focus on DFIs in particular, and development impact. So I was very pleased to be asked to do this study, and it's been great working with Swedfund. Lots of cooperation. It's taken quite a long time, but I think there's been a great, very positive working relationship. And just to say at the outset that I've been impressed by the commitment and the dedication of people in Swedfund, and clearly there's a sincere attempt to achieve significant impacts. And so the comments today should be taken in that light. I mean, there are some criticisms in the sense of recommendations for change, but that's recommendations as to how the primary goal of achieving impact could be more effectively achieved, really. And so, okay, so this is what we're going to be covering today. A little bit of context, also on Swedfund, talk about the research question and the methodological approach we took to that, and then some findings. For those who aren't steeped in evaluation, the word of ex ante just means before and ex post means after. So our findings, our ex ante findings relate to the asset allocation and project selection process that Swedfund have, and ex post is how the impacts of those investments are being measured. Yeah? And then I'll finish with some recommendations, and hopefully within 25 minutes. So the context is important in that Swedfund is the Swedish DFI, but there are a number of forces or sort of trends globally with respect to DFIs which are also relevant for Swedfund. The most important one is that DFIs generally, so DFIs are donor agencies which invest in private sector development in developing countries. And across many countries, and also in the multilateral sphere, there's been a significant increase in the amount of donor financing which is going into DFIs. So that's true of Swedfund, but also of CDC in the UK and lots of other DFIs. And so where in 2014, DFI commitments globally were about half that of total overseas development assistance or total aid, yeah? And it's increasing rapidly. So aid is kind of flat, but DFI investments are growing quite rapidly, and in time may even come to exceed total aid flows. Now, that's important in that it's not a random event. There's clearly an assumption on the part of donor agencies that DFIs are particularly powerful institutions for increasing the levels of investment in low-income countries, and particularly in the light of the funding gap for the Sustainable Development Goals, about 2.5 trillion, half of which needs to be private investment. We're a long, long way from that at the moment, but there clearly is an assumption that DFIs can collectively do something significant about that. So to be true, DFIs need to increase their own investments, and that's already happening, they're expanding. They also need to be able to, and most importantly really, to be able to mobilize significant private investment. Doesn't matter how big DFIs get, they're not going to be spending $1 trillion a year of investment. So they need to mobilize private investment. And thirdly, all of that investment together needs to achieve the maximum possible impacts on poverty and other development goals. So that's the broad context. So within that, I'm sure you're all broadly familiar with Swedfund, so I won't dwell on this. Been around since the late 1970s, now overseen by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministries for Enterprise and Innovation. Has the same mandate as Sweden's General Development Goals, which is there to contribute to creating the conditions for improved living standards for people living in poverty and facing repression. Swedfund provides loans and direct equity into firms and equity through funds, intermediated equity. Generally, they sort of invest for 7 to 10 years, an increasing focus on low-income countries, and Swedfund operates according to 3 pillars from an impact perspective. So that's impact on society, jobs and tax, sustainability, both environmental and with respect to working conditions and corruption, and the financial viability of firms. So they're looking to increase the productivity and the commercial success of the firms they invest in. And all potential investments are screened for impact and risks. So risks are identified at that stage, and then various processes put in place to mitigate those risks over time, and indicators set and tracked and so on to measure impact. From 2009 to 14, Swedfund had annual losses across the portfolio, not enormous, but mid-high single digits. More recently, returns, Swedfund's become profitable, positive returns. Outstanding assets are a little over 4,000 million Swedish krona, and that sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money, yeah. But in the wider context, Swedfund is one of the smallest European DFIs, probably the smallest. It's about the same size as Finnfund, but a quarter of the size of Norfund and only 5% of the size of FMO, for example. So it's quite small. Okay, so this was the research question we were posed. Have the investments undertaken by Swedfund contributed to poverty reduction? And if so, to what extent and how? Methodologically, it's a big question, but the evaluation was relatively small. We didn't have vast amounts or vast budget or time, really. So we were reliant on the data collected by Swedfund for their own impact that we could use. We weren't in a position to go and collect primary data, really. The resources that were available to us, but also the nature of the work and the timescale that we had meant that you can't do randomized controlled trials and that sort of thing on a big scale, really, not least because it would be quite unethical to try and do it. But many experimental approaches, or most experimental approaches, are just not possible in this kind of approach. So we developed a theory-based design based upon the construction of a theory of change. So we start off with a Swedfund investment, and what impacts are we hoping to see from that? And what's the sort of causal chain between the investment and the impact? This here, which you probably can't see very well, is a generic theory of change from someone called Ted Jackson, who was actually on the reference group, advising us on the project, but just sets out how this is supposed to work, really. You have investment to an enterprise, that enterprise then, and there's different types of enterprises here, SMEs, financial services, and so on, infrastructure. That enterprise then employs people, their income rises, that leads to higher household incomes, which has an ultimate effect upon well-being indicators, which might be child mortality, nutrition, and so on, yeah? So this the right-hand column here, that's the ultimate goal of the investments that Swedfund and other types of investors which are trying to achieve impact, that's the rationale for what they're trying to do. So that's for impact investment. So we developed a theory of change for DFIs in general, which has 6 links. Now, in the interest of time, I won't go into this in too much detail, but the point to make is that each one of these links, so the first one there, so Swedfund makes an investment. As part of that investment, it attracts private co-investment or co-investment from other DFIs. That increases the level of investment, allows economic activity to expand. But the last column is the important, is the crucial one really. So the theory of change like this is based upon underlying assumptions. And the key underlying assumption there is that this investment wouldn't have happened without Swedfund. Yeah? And so in that sense, it's financially additional, as we would call it. Because if it's not financially additional, then any impacts you see down the line can't be attributed to Swedfund because that had happened anyway. Yeah? So that's the crucial assumption there. And then in each link, there is a similar level of assumptions which are required to be true in order for these things to happen. Yeah? So we have the investment. That leads to increased economic activity, creates more jobs, local growth, which ultimately leads to national growth. Now, the assumptions there is that the jobs and income which are being created are sustainable. So Swedfund invests in a firm, it employs more people, but those jobs are then permanent jobs and they last. Yeah? Because if they last a month, then you're not going to see the impacts down the line. Right? On the, I suppose have I got a light on? I suppose no. Excellent. So here, in terms of indirect effects, the local growth impacts are based upon the assumption that investments are being made in sectors which we might consider to be transformative, which are likely to lead to higher levels of growth. Yeah? Some sectors will have a greater spillover effect on growth than others. Yeah? So that's the assumption underpinning that. Next, that these investments lead to a demonstration effect. So the private sector look at what Swedfund has done, see that actually these investments are both viable and profitable, and then down the line they start to invest in the same types of things, yeah? Leading to, again, more investment, more economic activity, and so on. These direct and indirect effects, it trickles down. So we have incomes rising, well-being increases, better living standards, equitable growth. And assumptions here are that not only are jobs sustainable, but wages are reasonably high, jobs are fulfilling, and the goods and services produced are both affordable for people and useful. Yeah? So it's not that luxury products necessarily are being produced, but things which poorer people particularly need and can afford to buy. That localized growth is inclusive in that it's broad-based, so employment effects are relatively wide across local communities. Local taxes are collected efficiently, and the same sort of effects at the national level, really. So that then leads to, again, trickling down, more growth effects through the transformative sector argument, both locally and nationally, which leads to increased tax revenues, which government can then spend on public services, which improves the provision of local and public services. And finally, all of this together, more economic activity, more and better public service provision leads to higher local and national well-being. Yeah? So that's broadly speaking, that's the logic which underpins the entire rationale for what DFIs are supposed to be doing. Yeah? That their investments lead through these chains to local and national effects, which otherwise would not have happened. Yeah? Okay, so ideally, in an evaluation, each of those links, what you would do is identify the link, assess the evidence in support of it, and particularly test the assumptions that are underpinning it. I say this is a small evaluation, so we weren't able to do primary research on the ultimate well-being impacts, and had to use the data we had. So Swedfund collects data up to about link 3 in that theory of change, which is out at the output level. So it's about jobs, financial performance, tax, and ESGs, environment, social, and governance indicators. So we were there. So we were able to assess their impact using those indicators, those output indicators, in an ex-post way. So we looked at what happens down the line after a Swedfund investment in those 4 areas. Now, another way of approaching the valuation is on an ex-ante basis. So rather than look at the impact that's been created, we look at the types of investments which are being made and think about what that says about the nature of the impacts which would be likely to occur. Are the investments being made in the types of sectors and markets where we would be likely to see high development impacts? So what does that mean in practice? We did a quite extensive review of the evidence relating investment investment choices and development impacts, which suggested that the impacts would be greatest when investments are focused in low-income countries and the poorest regions of those countries. This is quite self-evident, really. Clearly, you can have the greatest potential impact on poverty in areas where poverty is most acute. Yeah? Doesn't mean you will achieve that impact. The potential impact is greatest. It will also be greatest in sectors where countries have the greatest potential competitive advantage. And there's no point putting all your money into the aerospace industry in a relatively low-income country because it's unlikely they're going to be internationally competitive in that space. But what sectors would there be a potential advantage and why? And thirdly, that investors are focused in sectors with the greatest potential impact on poverty, employment, and inclusive or pro-poor growth. Now, all of that varies quite a lot from country to country, but not completely. There are some commonalities. Looking at the literature on evidence would suggest the following, that ranking there from a sector perspective. So the most the sector with the greatest potential impact is agriculture, largely because in low-income countries particularly, a quite high proportion of the population is involved in agriculture in some way or another. So your potential there to achieve positive change will be high. Secondly, manufacturing, especially light manufacturing. And that's largely because of the employment generation potential. Third, infrastructure and energy and construction to a lesser extent. And that's not so much direct effects, but the importance of those sectors in facilitating other economic activity. Fourth, services. Fifth, the financial sector. And lastly, extractives, the mining sector. And I'll come back to the financial sector point, because that's a little controversial. The Swedfund, we'll get onto this in a minute. Preempt myself. Okay, so if that's where you're going to achieve the greatest impact, how does Swedfund look in comparison? So from 2009 to 14, we see a significant increase in investments in Africa relative to other regions, reflecting a strategic shift within Swedfund to focus on low-income countries. So around 60% of the portfolio is now in sub-Saharan Africa. Another major change was an increase in the weighting of loans compared to equity in the portfolio, quite a sharp increase. Around 47% of the portfolio is now in loans and 53% in equity. About half that's direct equity and half is through funds. The table there gives country-level exposures for 2016, so not by region, by country. And it's quite interesting. So for both loans and equities, the two largest countries from an investment perspective are Kenya and India. And the largest categories of investment are firms or equity funds with a pan-African focus. There's some anomalies. Georgia and Serbia are quite high, but I think that reflects historical, that's a legacy thing, it's reflecting a previous historical focus on those regions. And of the four largest countries, only Tanzania is a low-income country at the moment. So the conclusion from that, the shift to low-income countries is positive, but there's some potential to accelerate that process. On a sector basis, the headlines are major increase, or an increase in the weighting of finance. Agriculture's disappeared from the portfolio. Manufacturing is the largest sector, and finance next. Infrastructure is also quite large. And there's been quite a sharp increase in renewable energy. From an ex-ante perspective, the high weighting to transformative sectors of manufacturing and agriculture, and infrastructure is very positive. The shift out of agriculture is less so. If you're concerned with development impact, there should be a greater focus on agriculture. But I understand that the portfolio there may actually be more weighting to agriculture than comes out of these figures in practice. And the shift into finance, which is common across the DFI sector, really, it's not the evidence to support that isn't particularly strong, really. It may be. I mean, I understand the logic of it. If you invest in a bank, they then invest in lots of small enterprises, and you get your impact that way. But there's not a lot of evidence to support that, and not least because investing through banks it's a second level of impact that's quite difficult to assess, really. On the ex-post assessment, we had some general data issues. Swedfund's a small DFI, so the portfolio is small, so the sample size is small. We only had data for a small number of years, 2 or 3 years, and we didn't have any baseline data, so at the point of investment, we don't know what happened between then and the data we have. We can only look at the period here, so it might be that lots of changes occurred here, but we just can't see them. Yeah, and a lot of the data comes from surveys of investees, which is quite mixed, really. 70% of firms responded on finance, but only 30% on tax. And some of the approaches to ESG are quite new, so the conclusions you can draw on that are limited. So on finance, we see an increase in revenues over the period we looked at, but that may well be driven by the increase in loans relative to equity rather than anything that Swedfund's doing. The equity fund investments are performed quite poorly, and this is a key point, really, that if you look at the data of financial returns, Swedfund's very exposed to fluctuations in large investments on a yearly basis, and that's because it's a small DFI. A larger institution could diversify that risk away, but a smaller institution can't really do that. And this is important because the strategic shift into more challenging environments suggests that's going to get worse, not better. And so what to do about that is a major challenge, I think. On employment, at the portfolio perspective, very little sort of change. Within equities, there's a net loss of jobs, and on the loan portfolio, there's a net increase in jobs, particularly in more recent loans and particularly in Africa. Tax revenues, we didn't have enough data really to say anything meaningful. It's just too volatile, and we only had a couple of years. So you couldn't say very much, really. But the processes that Swedfund have in place with respect to tax are very positive. They're set out here, so they screen out complex structures or overly complex structures, encouraging firms to pay their share of tax, and importantly, requiring firms or asking firms to report on a country-by-country basis, which is, I won't have time to get into it, but that's very important. We can come back to it maybe in the Q&A. A more general point is it's not clear that tax is a great measure of anything, really, the way it's done here, because loads of things influence what a company pays in tax on any given year. They may have a tax holiday, they may make a big investment. None of these things have got anything to do with Swedfund, so it's quite difficult to look at that reported tax as having been driven by Swedfund's activities. On ESG, more positive, we designed a little index of ESG and then compared that with various other indicators and found that loans performed better than equities. African investments were of the regions were worse on ESG issues. Importantly, older investments perform better than newer ones, suggesting that the longer Swedfund is engaged with the company, the better it does on ESG issues, which was good. And the same positive relationship between the size of the investment and the percentage stake. Yeah, so the more influence Swedfund has, the longer it holds an investment, the better it seems to be for ESG outcomes, which is very positive. Okay, so the summary of our findings are here. I mean, in the interest of time, maybe I'll just skip straight through, really. But the main thing to say is, ex ante, there's some positive developments in terms of low-income countries in some sectors, which could be improved. And ex post, the impacts we can see are quite limited, but there does seem to be a positive impact on the ESG side and also with respect to loans. But given the data and sample size issues we face, we can't say more than this, really. It's very likely that Swedfund's impact is larger than it appears, although it could be smaller, obviously. But we don't have the evidence to say. So the question is, how could they increase their impact significantly, but then also measure that accurately? And this is a key strategic issue, okay? The potential for impact will be greatest, as I've said, in countries and regions where the need for investment is greatest, but there also where you have the greatest risks. And as a small DFI, Swedfund's vulnerable to very large losses, which are going to get worse, right? So there's 5 possible responses. Carry on as now and just manage the risk and hope it's all right. Change the strategy to invest in lower risk countries, but that undermines the impact you're trying to achieve. Continue to increase loans, but that could also, there's limits to that, and it could have other negative effects. And more fundamentally, there's two options here. Accelerate the strategy of moving more into challenging markets, but accept that that's going to mean losses and be comfortable with that and have regular capital injections into Swedfund to compensate for that. Or the alternative would be to expand the size of Swedfund significantly so that they could absorb those losses through diversification across the portfolio. Yeah? Now, I know. So this is my last slide. So recommendations, and these recommendations should be seen as they're complementary, or not complementary. That I wouldn't recommend one without the other. So I think if the focus is on maximizing poverty impact, then the strategy of low-income country, or increasing the weighting of low-income countries should increase. That requires some structural change to address the risks it's going to create. Either Swedfund becomes a more specialist DFI focusing on those sectors, but not necessarily running themselves on a commercial basis and accept there'll be losses, or it expands and diversifies as just described. Now, that requires more money, more public funds, and the flip side of that is that there has to be a much better focus on measuring impact. Yeah, and perhaps the most important thing I'll say today actually is that Swedfund, it's not they don't measure enough things; they measure lots of things, hundreds of indicators in some ways. But what's needed is a much narrower focus on a core set of indicators which are measured consistently over time. And even to sort of like for everyone to step back and say, what are we trying to achieve here? What are the 4 things we're trying to achieve? And if those are the things we're trying to achieve, how would we measure that accurately? And then to keep that and focus only on those indicators and run that over time. That's very difficult. It's easy to say, it's difficult to do in practice, I appreciate. And that's not just for Swedfund, that's for the ministries that are involved in, from a governance perspective, that everyone has to agree that collectively and put in place a framework that enables Swedfund to do what they're trying to do, but have clarity about what that is, and then to measure that accurately. Yeah? And then that needs to be, you want a robust impact measurement system that is not too onerous, that's capturing that properly, and then to feed all that into an ex-ante framework which is designed robustly to identify those investments which will have the greatest impact and to invest in those in such a way that that potential can be realized, yeah? And that should evolve over time, because what will be the most impactful thing now, in 5 years' time, may be different, yeah? So you need to be able to have an evolving process of measurement feeding into project design and selection, which changes over time. And I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for taking us quickly through a very complicated report. There's a lot to think about in it, both about impact and the processes of generating impact. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Maria Håkansson, and you are the new Chief Executive Officer of Swedfund. New, I think, last month or something like that. 2 months? Yeah. So you can see this as EBA's welcoming present for you. Interesting to hear your comments on it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I want to start by extending my thanks both to EBA and to Professor Spratt for this report. I think it caters for a very important discussion. We actually started this morning by presenting it to the staff at Swedfund, and it was very appreciated. I think it's good to see that someone understands all the different and complicated dimensions of our business, and I think it caters for a good discussion and also important input for us going forward. If we take a few words around Swedfund and our mission, it is actually to fight poverty by investing in sustainable businesses. This is an important but also very complex mission, just like Professor Spratt described. History shows there is a clear linkage between growth and eradication of poverty. Now, growth is not evenly distributed between countries or even within countries. So to cater for sustainable and inclusive growth is very important. And here I think the DFIs can play a very important role. By providing financing to the private sector, combined with sustainable and responsible investment practices, we can be catalytical and additional. We can create an impact, but also really mobilize the private capital that is needed to fulfill the Agenda 2030 goals. When we talk about impact, just to be clear on the definition, we talk about investments into organizations, funds, and companies with the ambition to generate impact on society and an environment, and at the same time cater for a financial return. Swedfund has been active since 1979 in some of the world's most challenging and high-risk markets. That means that we have a long experience from this. If you combine this experience with our definition of impact, that was actually the foundation for the creation of a new investment model that was launched in 2013. And I want to take a minute just to describe what that model means. It rests on these three pillars of impact on society, sustainability, and financial viability. And we actually work with this across our investment process, from screening to analysis to due diligence, contract signing, through the value creation and also in the exit phase. If we look at the three different pillars, impact on society, that's about numbers of jobs created, it's about CO2 emissions, taxes paid, and share of females in the workforce and in leading positions. Sustainability, that includes many different aspects. One is of course related to decent work conditions and making sure, for example, that we follow the ILO core protocols and conventions. To work with the environmental questions, that could, for example, include and to work with an environmental management system. And then finally, it's also about handling corruption, making sure that you have good practices and policies in place to cater for this. And then finally, financial viability, to build strong and profitable companies that will actually survive in the long term. Because if that's not the case, then what's the value of the development effects that we actually create? We are a long-term investor, but after 7 to 10 years we will exit, and then we want our companies to survive and to continue to have these good effects. The results that we achieve are presented in what we call our integrated report. We have brought a number of examples here today, and I would be happy if you will take that and read more about the different results that we have achieved. The important thing with that is an integrated report. That means that our auditors have not only looked at the financial numbers, but also what we have achieved when it comes to impact on society and ESG. And I think it's a good way to try to describe how you can actually integrate these three pillars. Then I fully agree and concur with that there's more we can do when it comes to the data and how we can measure the impact over time, and I will come back to that one. So if you look upon us, we invest, but our capital comes with conditions, both on following different policies, protocols, and conventions, but also about taking actions. During our due diligence, we identify a lot of different gaps and actions that the companies that we invest in need to commit to that they will fulfill. But our capital doesn't only come with conditions, it also comes with competence and support. One example can be technical assistance projects that we work with the companies to make sure that they can close the gaps so we can really achieve the impact that we intended to. If we continue the discussion then and look into what are we investing in. I mean, Swedfund is a state-owned company, and we follow the directives provided by our owners, which guides us then to invest in the poorest countries in the world. We focus on DAC 1, 2, and 3, and with an ambition to doing more than 50% in DAC 1 and 2. As we have been active for many years, we of course have some older investments, and as you saw on the presentation then, we also have investments still today in countries that are not in that category. But we are a responsible owner also for those, and will over time, of course, cater for an exit. But the focus we have means that we today mainly invest in sub-Saharan Africa and selected countries in Asia. And if you look on the portfolio mix, it is actually so that more than 60% of our investments are now in sub-Saharan Africa. And I have the advantage then, since we have presented the report for 2017, to look at the country mix. I brought that with me just to give an idea on what has happened only in 1 year's time. So the biggest countries now are Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, India, Ghana, and Tanzania. And I think that clearly shows that our focus on really going for the poorest countries have an impact fairly quickly on the portfolio mix. To have a high share in sub-Saharan Africa like we have, more than 60%, actually makes us unique among the DFIs. No one else has such a high share of their investments in this part of the world. And our ambition is, of course, to continue with this, because we believe that this is really where we can create an impact. The other dimension is around the sectors. And here we had a new strategy for Swedfund set at the end of last year. And here the decision was to focus on 3 sectors, which is health, energy, climate, and the financial sector. Considering the size of Swedfund, being actually the smallest DFI in Europe, focus is very important for us. We can only focus on a few sectors at a time. Then looking at the report, I think it's very valuable input for us to look at and see which are the other sectors that we should evaluate over time and make sure that we also go into going forward. And I think also the proposal of having this dynamic process where we look at the ex-post results when deciding which sectors to go into is very important. But very briefly then, why have we chosen these sectors? Well, if you start and look at the energy sector, 1.2 billion people lack access to energy. 700 million people lack access to adequate water services. 2.5 billion people lack access to improved water sanitation. And there is a $1.5 trillion annual gap in investments, which is of course why we need to increase our investments in renewable energy, water and sanitation. If you look on health, more than 400 million people don't have access to basic essential health services. And only 2% of the world's doctors are active in sub-Saharan Africa, which is of course a giant gap to close, and that's why the health sector is important for us. Now the financial sector is an interesting one because I have a little bit of a different opinion here. If you look at the local markets, they are very, very shallow, these financial markets. They have high interest rates, and it's very difficult to allocate capital to small and mid-sized enterprises, or SMEs. If you look at job creation, SMEs in a normal developed countries represent approximately 2/3 of all jobs created, while in a developing country it can be as high as 80%. So it's extremely important that they get access to capital. Now for a DFI, it's very hard to reach out to these small companies, and we need to find a vehicle to do that, and that's why we collaborate with funds and with banks. And for us, this is a way both to bring forward our conditions on ESG and impact on society, like I talked about, but also trying to direct our funds either through microfinancing, for example, then targeting agriculture or female entrepreneurs or renewable energy projects, and the same when we work with banks and funds. Then I think the challenge is that there is still a gap when it comes to a good follow-up in certain aspects. With funds it's easier, but with banks there is still some more work that can be done when it comes to the collection of data. And here I think we need to collaborate much more with the other DFIs to make sure that we can actually do that in a good way. If we look at the level of investments then, just to talk about the size. Last year we invested 800 million SEK. This year we are increasing it to 1.2 billion. Half of that comes from additional funding from the government, and the rest actually comes from returns from our own portfolio. When we invest, we don't only look at sectors, but we also have two themes that cut across all our investments. One is around climate and energy, which is of course so important that it doesn't only go for the renewable energy projects, but it needs to be part of every investment that we do, and that comes with the ESG responsibility. And the second one is gender. Because women empowerment is of course extremely important to drive the development of society. But then interestingly enough, it's also so that companies that have a good gender mix, they actually perform better. So it also supports the pillar of financial viability. I can talk about this for a long time, but I will just take a minute to talk about it. And I think you can do this in so many ways. It's both around which areas you select to invest in. If you work with health and renewable energy, that has a strong impact on women in these countries. But it can also be, as I said, by targeting the investment in the financial sector towards female entrepreneurs. The other aspect is how do you work with working conditions in the companies that we invest in, around salaries, working condition in general, the right to vacation, the right to organize, and so on. Then we also work with developing the women who work in our companies. We have a special program for that called Women for Growth. And then finally, we work actively on having more women in leading positions and also on the boards. So this is a few examples on how we try to work with a gender and a team across our investments then. But if we get into this very important aspect of the indicators, I can only concur and agree with what you bring forward. Today, we measure 11 different targets that comes with instructions from our owners. And I think the discussion on tax is a very good one that points out the challenges we have. We work with the right questions, but at the same time, it's hard for us to prove the impact and to find the right measurement. So we need to continue that work. The other part is, of course, that it's extremely important to measure over a longer period of time. And as I said, we introduced our model in 2013. which means that we still have a significant part of our portfolio that is according to an older model. And many investments that follow the new model are done in 2014, 15, 16, which means that there's very few data points for us to measure. But we will continue that work, and I think it's extremely important to try to find these few indicators that really show the important impact that we have. And again, I think it's good with the integrated report. It shows we have added one more year, and I think you can find some good illustrations of the positive trends that we see in the work that we are doing. So, to summarize then, Swedfund is the smallest DFI, and we work in high-risk countries. We have a very limited possibility to work with our portfolio to take away the risk. And I don't think we should. It's good for us to work with a certain level of loans to get the financial stability, but if we want to fulfill our mission, we really need to continue to invest in the poorest countries in the world. So of course we welcome this discussion on how do we fulfill the challenges in the best way and how can we find a way forward when it comes to financing. And I really believe that we have a strong and solid base. We have a long experience in working in these markets. We have a well-working investment model that actually caters for the different aspects. We have a way of measuring it. And I think based on this and our experience, we can really contribute by being an additional, bringing in and mobilizing more private capital and really create an impact to fulfill the Agenda 2030 goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. I find it hard to believe that you have only been here for 2 months. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Now, Arne, it's my pleasure to welcome you here. Arne Bigsten is also on EBA. We are colleagues there. We actually always sit next to each other in the meetings, and so we do here. Arne is a professor at the University of Gothenburg, Department of Economics. Special interest in tax development, private investment, many other things.
Thanks.
Welcome, Arne.
Thank you. I think this is a quite interesting report that addresses a very challenging task. Looking at what you've been able to do is first to have quite problematic data issues to deal with. You don't have a very long time series and it's not covering all the aspects you're interested in on the one hand. And the other is that it's methodologically very hard to do an impact assessment on the basis of the data you have and the approaches that you have time to apply. So it's tricky to get to the definite conclusions as to what the impacts are. But you have all the relevant balls in the air anyway and provide quite an interesting discussion. And the challenges then you want to focus on is the impact on poverty, which is a key Swedish target. And you're not able to sort of measure specifically, but indirectly you suggest it has certain impacts, etc. You cite also the World Bank Independent Evaluation Group that actually says that it's virtually impossible to track development impacts of money channeled through financial institutions. So it's a very hard thing to do. And the question is, what is the counterfactual? And if you go back to when aid started, in the sort of 1950s, 60s, etc., the idea then was that basically aid was a substitute for low savings in developing countries. They could save too little, so you needed more investment resources to come in. And private investment was not coming in at that time, so this would be the substitute in a way. That was the original aid idea. If you look at the flows today of resources to developing countries, aid is a very small share of the resource flows. Most parts of the world is at less than 1% of GDP. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's maybe around 3%. It's higher in some other places. So aid needs to try to find its niche or its specific uses. It's not going to be the big supplier of investment resources to the developing world. And we can think about it in how you would analyze it. In principle, what you have in the report is rather direct effects of investments on employment, for example, and revenue generation. But of course, the indirect effects are there, and they could be huge, and they might even be more important. And originally, the development notion was basically that you would develop the modern sector and suck people out of agriculture by expanding the modern sector. And it might well be the case that this is the most effective way to reduce poverty. I was in Taiwan in the 90s, for example, talked to people about what they did to poverty, since it had disappeared, more or less. And they said they never thought about poverty, they thought about productivity and suck up people that way. But that's an angle that is not directly picked up here, although the authors point to the focus on certain sectors which are relevant from a growth or employment perspective. So it's a challenge to think about DFIs. And the first challenge then is, and I'm not sure this is, maybe Stephen has the literature at his fingertips, but is this the best way to use aid money, or is it a better way to use aid money relative to education or other types of aid investment, if aid uses? I'm not sure that is the case. I think it could be, but it would be nice to hear whether there is a proper analysis, or if it can be done, some sensible analysis of this issue. Because that's the first question. Should we have Swedfund at all? Or should we have a bigger Swedfund? That's something which is not discussed here. Basically, the discussion is, given that we have it, what should we do if we want to achieve certain targets? And as I said, I think structural change is quite an important dimension in development, even if you want to reduce poverty. So it's important to keep that in mind and try to think more about that and let the market sort of handle some of the poverty reduction in that sense. Then, of course, we have all these issues of externalities. You have certain disadvantaged groups, people in certain regions, etc. You want to focus. You deal with externalities by going in with direct investment resources, and that is fine as well. But it is sometimes hard to get it right, I think, via this channel. And what the main conclusions in terms of impacts in the report seems to be is that the revenues are driven by the loan portfolio, essentially. That's where the investment is most profitable, while the equity individual investments are performing poorly, in a sense. And that's to some extent because they are in complicated places. And another thing that's pointed out in the report is that there is very high demands on Swedfund to deliver on all kinds of indicators, lots and lots of indicators. It's not like a bank which is sort of profit maximizing and that's it, more or less, with some exceptions. But basically it's a very broad agenda that you're supposed to challenge with this tool. And I think that's, you both discussed it a bit, it's problematic, whichever way you look at this. So the report sort of suggests that either you go down the route with high risk, complicated investments in meeting a bunch of requirements, direct poverty focus, etc., and accept the losses. And that's okay, I think, if you can really focus externalities which you're interested in, like certain regions are poor, certain groups are excluded, some sectors are not picking it up or something, or gender issues, or whatever. Or go for more of a bank approach, a more self-sufficient approach, trying to invest in resources in sectors where there is, where you can be profitable. So I think there are some questions to be thought about seriously about Swedfund or DFIs generally. I do think that the private sector development is the key to get these countries, get economic take off. So from that point of view, investments in manufacturing or in agriculture, for that matter, is important. But the question is how to approach this in a sort of sensible way. I think, for example, I've talked to somebody who's looked at the funds in Denmark, and they are much more profitable. They're much bigger, of course, much more profitable, and they are not as hard driven by many indicators that you're supposed to maximize against. So my take on this is that, well, first, I would like to know if anybody has a good answer as to whether DFIs is a good approach to achieve some kind of benefits relative to other uses of money. I don't know, I haven't really checked this literature. But it seems to me, when you look at the report and what it describes, Swedfund doing, it's doing a very complicated operation. What's working is when you use the simpler channels with loans, other DFIs, etc. When you try to do your own investment, it's really, really hard. So, say that we keep Swedfund, DFI is a good thing. I'm willing to accept that for the time being anyway. Maybe you should try to make life easier. If you believe this story of mine as well, growth, drives structural change, absorbs people out of the rural sectors into more better-paying jobs, etc. If you believe that channel is important, maybe you should not try to hit all targets at the same time. Maybe you should choose poor countries, I agree on that. Maybe even choose poor regions or sectors, but then make life easier and say maximize profits given that. That try to make profitable investments where you get your money back and you can get more investments and get higher economic growth. So that's my one potential recommendation. Make life easier by focusing on the poor countries and maybe poor regions, but don't try to deal with all the issues at the same time. Growth is a powerful determinant of what happens to poverty if you look around the world. The Chinese, I mean, they sucked people from the rural areas, 500 million or so, by not worrying much about poverty reduction, but worrying about growth. So it is a target as well. But as we say, this is a small chunk of money, so maybe you need to do something different here. An alternative to that would be to use guarantees or something like that, but which also would be a way to enhance private sector investment. But my overall reading of the report is that Swedfund is trying to do two complicated things. It should be simplified, focus on poor countries, and then maybe maximize your profits with some restraints, but not all of those that you have. And then you get money back, you invest it again. Thank you.
Thank you. That sounds very easy, but somehow I think you meant it to be a bit more complex, because you usually don't make things easier for audiences. More thinking is better. Great, thank you. Well, now we have heard the report and two responses to it, and glad to have questions from the audience on the report and on Swedfund and private sector development. And you can, of course, direct your questions to any of the three of us up here. Well, to me as well, in fact, if you want to, but foremost to my colleagues here, of course. We don't have that much time, and it's a big report with many difficult issues, so I'll try to be a little bit tough and both cut questions short and make sure that we get many questions and short questions rather than a few and long ones. But enough being said. Questions, please? Okay, let me start there with you. Yeah.
It's Björn from Development Today. I came from a presentation yesterday when Northfund presented its annual report. And they presented a very good result. And an analyst who was commenting on it, he said they had good skills and good reviews of projects, but they also have good luck. Swedfund has had several losses over the last years. So I was wondering, did you identify anything that has to do with shortage when it comes to scrutinizing the projects? Do they have broad enough competence? Or do they just have bad luck?
You or me?
Do you want to go?
I can start. I mean, I've only been 2 months, so I will start, and then if there is facts, maybe Karin, you can help me and complement with that. But I think if you look on the losses over, I mean, several of those are older investments, and as I described them, the new investment model was actually implemented in 2013. And that is where we try to cater a little bit for looking into those different aspects. So we actually have a more thorough, just like Professor Spratt brought up, and process and looking at the different aspects when we make our risk analysis. Then I think like this, we are humble. I mean, in we learn a lot when you are in high-risk countries and you invest in complex industries. I think you have to do a good exit analysis also. What can you learn from this investment and your mistake, and continuously bring that into your process. Then I think the other fact is that if you look on the size of Norfund, they can actually absorb individual projects that go wrong. For us, it's enough with one that goes wrong in a year, and that means the financial result goes sour. So, and that is actually an important part to consider when we look at this. And I think there is also, if I look historically, there is a few projects that have really dragged down the result. But every year there are a few that are sold with a profit and a few that are sold with a minus.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that the project appraisal and due diligence processes the Swedfund had are quite good. You know, I don't think that's a problem. I mean, things can always improve, of course, but the Swedfund's operating in challenging environment, and losses will happen. Yeah, I mean, and that's just if no, it's sort of capitalism to some extent. If nobody made any losses, then there'd be something slightly wrong, really, and they'd only be investing in very safe bets where there was no sort of risk being taken by Swedfund or other investors. So I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I think that the size of Swedfund relative to Norfund is a problem. And how else? I'd also possibly take Norfund's amazing results with a slight pinch of salt. Well, not so much that, but people put a, you know, naturally institutions put the best light they can on things. And I'm sure there's plenty of losses hidden away in Norfund's portfolio as well.
Thanks. You have a question down there? Yes, you.
Thank you. My name is Heidi Lampinen. I'm from Union to Union, which is the trade union solidarity support organization. And I, of course, have a question on employment creation, because I was finding here that there is no evidence of positive direct job creation resulting from Swedfund's investments, which is interesting. And also you made a reference to the ILO core conventions, which is, of course, a basic minimum floor of trade union rights, etc. So I would like to hear something more about that, of the findings, and of course what Swedfund wants to, how to take this forward. Thanks.
Shall I go first?
Yeah, you go first.
Yeah. So we said there's no evidence of employment effects, but that's largely a result of the data. Yeah. We only had data for a limited number of years. And as I say, we didn't have baseline data for what the situation was when the investment was initially made, so you don't know what happened. It could be that there'd been a significant increase in employment in the years before we had the data, or the opposite. Yeah. So it's I'm not saying that there's been no impact at all. It's just that we can't see it in the data, and if we can't see it in the data, we can't report it. I mean, it's also. There are some complexities to this as well, in that, to some extent, it's not just employment, it's sustainable, good quality employment, yeah? And there may even be as a company becomes more productive, it might reduce employment at certain points as well. I mean, I'm not saying there's any causality there at all. So just looking at a headline employment figure in any one point in time doesn't tell you about the long-term sustainable trajectory of employment growth in that institution, yeah. And so when we didn't have the data to say anything about that, but I'll leave it to Maria to.
And I think that's a good point. I mean, when you look at the creation of jobs, then I think you need to have a baseline and you need to measure the impact over years. I also think if you look on our portfolio and you look on the fact that we have had some manufacturing as part of the portfolio, there might be, due to efficiencies, reductions in the number of jobs just because of that. But then you haven't measured the level of jobs, for example. So, the job creation question in itself becomes very complicated. Our general approach is that we want to invest to create more jobs, but we need a longer time period to measure it. If you add 2017 in the integrated report, you will see that it's actually increasing, so we have a positive impact. But I think you need to consider all the different challenges, as always, in the measurement. It's one data point, of course. When it comes to the ILO core conventions and protocols, for us, our ambition is to create decent jobs. And my example was more saying that we actually bind that in our contracts. We include that in our agreements as one minimum level that you actually have to fulfill. Then our ambition is, of course, we want to be in the poorest countries in the world because we believe that we can make a difference and that we can work with an improvement plan. When it comes to working conditions in general, it's around having a annual salary revision process. It's around the overall environment, the safety. I mean, how do you regulate working hours, vacation, parental leave, and so on. So for us, it's very important to have that improvement plan going and that there's an annual review of that. But where you start is, of course, very different in different countries and in different companies. So I think it's hard to say a general answer, but our ambition, and that's why we're in there, is, of course, to create an impact. So, I mean, the way we try to describe it is use the word decent jobs. That's what we want to create, and to drive that development over time. So I hope that's an answer to your question. If you want to, we can continue the discussion offline.
Okay, we had a question from there, but can I then ask, I can only count to 3 at a time, so let me see what other questions there were. 1, 2, 3. Okay, fine, thanks. That's 3 more.
Thank you. My name is Stefan Isaacson. I'm a former board member, so I'll direct my question to Stephen. One of the questions I had was, did you have any chance at all to look into the kind of benchmarking effect that Swedfund might actually have in the discussions when they do an investment? Because many times, even though Swedfund might be the smallest indeed, they're actually usually doing their investment together with other financiers, as such then also shifting perhaps or hopefully the discussion towards the goals that the government set forth. So do you have any kind of quality indicators in that context? Because I think that that kind of change takes time and there's a need for the discussion to take place in the boardrooms, etc. So that's the first one. Second question is actually pertaining to the issue of whether or not to have equity investments or not. And I think that's a very interesting question, but I think that sort of boils down to what you said, Stephen, that's about size of the portfolio. So could you elaborate a little bit on what would be an appropriate de minimis size of the portfolio really to be efficient in that sense? Thank you.
Shall I go now?
No, you can wait.
Okay.
Let's hear the response.
Oh, sorry. That's I was just working out the answer. Okay, so the impact on other investors. I mean, I think we don't have direct evidence of that, but indirectly we do, in the sense that you see ESG practices or performance improving in companies where Swedfund has had a significant stake. Yeah. Also, I mean, the other point to bear in mind is that Swedfund's often co-investing with other DFIs as well as private investors. I mean, to some extent, that's a part of a problem, really, in relation to the indicators point. So there's a whole DFI universe out there, and lots of conferences talking about harmonizing indicators and whatever, which results in a very large common pool of indicators that all DFIs are using, with some slight variations around it in terms of their emphasis and so on. So I think it's unlikely that Swedfund's going to be investing alone as a small investor in a big pool full of private sector actors in that sense. But to the extent that they're having an influence, it seems to be positive. On the minimum size for equity, I mean, I don't know. You mean the minimum size in terms of the equity stake or the size of Swedfund? Yeah, I mean, considerably bigger than now, I would say. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's an empirical question, really. You need to look at it separately. So we didn't do analysis on that, but you could, from a portfolio diversification perspective, you could come up with a clear answer on that in terms of, efficient market theory and all that sort of stuff. So if you want me to come up with an answer, you'd have to let me go away and come back.
Thank you. Well, no.
Okay. Matthew Fielding from the Stockholm Environment Institute. So there's so many things that have come up here. It's like a whole day I could be asking questions, but perhaps one of the main things is, first of all, there is clear that the task you had was huge and it was very much constrained. And so, to echo Arne's points as well, it's a real shame that you couldn't take it further to get to grips with some of the actual real issues and collect your own data as well. And perhaps that was just a comment. And then secondly, I really struggle with Swedfund's kind of identity. Of course, it's tricky to be a DFI. There are a whole range of in Swedfund's model, there's a range of constraints on its operations. But, is the bottom line profit or is it poverty reduction? That's something that comes up. And also then, if it's poverty reduction, if that's the overall outcome you want to see, then in your work, and Stephen alluded to it in his theory of change, if you don't go beyond outputs in terms of evaluating your own work, how are you ever going to understand what impact you've had on poverty reduction? It's an incredibly complex area. And then you kind of, Maria, you kind of implied in your answer, you said project failure drags down the result. So that's why I take it from that actually it's profit is the bottom line. And then so I just come back to Arne's point of perhaps it is better that you're clearer about we want to make a profit and actually stop trying to do everything all the time and actually focus really on what is it behind this business model. I'd appreciate comments back on that. Thanks.
Should I start?
If you like.
So a lot of questions in one, but let me start to clarify. When I say the result, I meant the financial result, just to be clear. And I think I come from the private sector, and I would say that in the private sector it's a little bit easier actually, because you're measured on profit. You need to get your business case, you need to get the return of your money, more or less in 3 years. But that model also fails, in my experience, because if you want to be in markets that are not functioning so well and that are poor, they will not invest there. So you need to have someone that is additional. That is my belief. Someone that is willing to look at other perspectives, that is catalytical and additional. That kind of player is needed. And I agree, and that is also what attracted me to start working at Swedfund, to really try to work on this equation. How do you find a good balance and solution? I don't think we can simplify if we want to reach Agenda 2030 and say it's either or. It is all of it. Then I think you, in each investment, need to figure out where do you put the emphasis. And maybe you should then, as you come back to saying, that there is a few set of indicators. And in this one, it's the job creation and it's maybe the environmental impact together with the financial result. And that's what we try to do in the action plans. Then we measure the total picture, but maybe we can be even clearer on that. But I honestly don't think we can make it that simple. That's my value belief. And I think a role as the DFI is very, very important in driving this and being the one who can try to show that also sustainability can be profitable, and that's also how you can drive investments.
Stephen?
Yeah, very good questions. I wanted to come back to Arne's points anyway, which, it's important to sort of focus on the fundamental questions that are at issue here, and I think he sort of raised that quite fundamental point in that what's the core objective of Swedfund and what are they trying to do? And I have a lot of sympathy with them, really, because on the one hand, you're asked to invest in profitable businesses, you're asked to mobilize investment, you're asked to have the greatest impact in the lowest income countries. Now, some of those things are incompatible with each other. That you'll have the greatest direct impact potentially in countries where it's impossible to mobilize investment. So you can't do both of those simultaneously and without there being some kind of trade-off. So stepping back and just being clear about what the objective is important. I mean, whilst you could just go on profitability, I would caution against it. Because then you could just invest in mining companies during a commodity boom and everyone would make loads of money. Yeah? So you need to think about it more subtly than that. So what are the, ideally what you'd have is some measure of development impact, which was tight enough to be understood and clearly tracked and followed, and then to target that. And as a consequence of that, your companies would be likely to be profitable, because otherwise they wouldn't be creating jobs and doing X, Y, and Z. But you would also hope to have other benefits. So coming up with some kind of core measure of what the impact is you're trying to achieve and what indicators would capture that, and then focusing on that. And also it being internally coherent in that different components of it aren't trade-offs against each other, because that makes it impossible. And there's that having clarity from the starting position of what's the objective is key. And then this goes back to Arne's point. Once you establish what the objective is, our DFIs like Swedfund the best instrument or vehicle for delivering that. That's a separate question, really. But it's a fundamental question. And I would agree with Arne that private sector development is clearly key. But you asked about the literature. There's no literature saying that DFIs are necessarily the best way of achieving it, but they're some mechanism for facilitating and fostering inclusive and sustainable private sector development is clearly fundamental. What that actual institution looks like is a separate question. And I would agree on the objectives first before designing. But I'm reminded of Ken Boulding. It's very difficult to turn an aeroplane into a helicopter while it's flying. Yeah, but you could sit down and design a helicopter a lot more easily, if you understand my point.
Just clarify what I meant when I said what I said. I don't think the DFIs like Swedfund should invest in anything. But my impression from reading this interesting report and from actually visiting Swedfund as well, that it's a very complex targets, hugely complex targets. There are smart people there doing a good job, but they have a complex target picture. So my suggestion is basically that some of these things should be moved to constraints. So, given that you are not going into mines, oils, and a few things, specify, only go to the poorest countries, and a few other things. Then, given that you stay within the framework defined by these constraints, maybe you should try to make a profit so you can survive and make more investments. I don't think people are not competent in Swedfund. I think they are pretty smart, those I met anyway. But they have a very complex thing to do, so you should make life easier for them while steering them into the niches where they should be, but there they should maximize profits. Maybe, something like that.
If I may comment, then, as
Yes.
I said, I think the focus is an important part, that we try to focus on a certain set of countries and a certain set of sectors, so I fully agree with that. Then I come back to the fact, I think you have to choose when you go into a project, what is it that you want to achieve in that one, and then you set the targets on that, and that may be different depending on where you invest. But always when you try to kind of extract it and make a general conclusion, it becomes complex because there are so many different dimensions. But I think clarity is important, and I welcome this discussion around what is the most important part of the different things that Swedfund can actually address. Because the way I see it is that with the competence and the experience that we have, we can do many different things, and then it becomes more a discussion of where do we add the most value then.
Thanks, good. We're running short of time, but there are two more questions, so can I ask you to be quite quick, and why don't you go first?
Thank you very much. I try to be very specific on the question. My name is Asif. I'm an economist by profession. I work for the UNDESA, and I served as the director for the Ministry of Finance, Asian World Bank, and I've been half decade in Sweden, so I now understand the sustainability model, how they work, and EAB has been a key role of providing this kind of a seminar. So I learned from my mentor Nelson Mandela when I was serving at the UN office that numbers are very good because we know how the poverty is created by robbing the countries and ruling them. It is good to appreciate people. So firstly, sincere thanks to everyone for doing this hard work. Swedfund is working very hard since 1979, and they have done a lot of nice work, EABA for all the staff working here. And I really appreciate the impact that we see here, that Maria has moved from the private sector to work for the development impact. She's doing a nice job, and 2018 strategy is really, really good. I'd like to learn more about it from you. I will try to contact you. Stephen, you know how the poverty created. British took everything from Africa and other ones. You tried to solve this issue, but you did not have the baseline, conclusion, or the data, which does not answer the question. I would like to read the report in detail. I would like to you again, because I know the Development Study Center tries to solve the problem by talking, but we need concrete solutions. Your recommendation, last point, you said Swedfund should contribute more with development agency. Are they not contributing as per the mission?
Okay, so to work more with, you mean the recommendation that they should work more with other development agencies? Yeah, so, well, that's part of the strategy. If the strategy is to invest in challenging markets, and one of the... Oh, they are, but they could do it more systematically. No, I mean, I said they should do it more. Yeah. Okay. Oh, so that, well, if that's the case, that wasn't... Okay, that wasn't my intention. Yeah, okay, fine, yeah, that wasn't my intention. I said...
Okay, point taken.
Point taken?
Yeah, good. And one final question then.
My name is Jan Engström.
Thank
I
you.
have a background in both Swedfund and private sector development. And it's more than 10 years since I left. I have one question. Is nowadays, I understand that Swedfund is brought more into low-income country groups. Before, Swedfund used to go into rather easy areas like more developing countries. And I have a question in relation to that. To what extent is there an exchange of ideas of constraints in the investment climate? For example, 10 years ago, Swedfund had 6 projects in Tanzania and a number of projects in Uganda. At the same time, there were bilateral programs in both countries. So I wonder, is there any flow of ideas between the two agencies? And second question, I noticed that the loan portfolio is growing quite fast. And I wonder whether it could be rather could be low additionality in some of these loans. I mean, provide a loan to global hotel chains. I wonder, is any additionality in that? I know that there are some projects in that field. Radisson in Ethiopia.
That's an equity investment.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Fine, thanks. I had missed one question from back there. Can we take that question too quickly, and then you can perhaps answer those?
Okay, yeah, I'll try.
Think about it now.
Thank you. My name is Penny Davis. I work for the Swedish development organization Diakonia, and we are also part of a pan-European network called Eurodad, which has scrutinized European DFIs for many years. I had a question on additionality directed to Mr. Spratt, and how you, based on the work you've done, assess Swedfund's ability to measure its additionality. You mentioned in the beginning that one of the underlying assumptions is that there is additionality, that is to say that a project would not have happened unless Swedfund had invested in it. And if this can't be proven, all other impacts sort of become irrelevant. So I know this is a very difficult question, how to measure it, and I would like your comment on that. Thank you.
Do you want me to go first?
You can go first on that.
Sure.
One, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, on the additionality point, this is a DFIs, Swedfund's not unique in this. They've been talking about additionality for a long, long time. Yeah, but measuring financial, so there's different forms of additionality. The way I look at it, you're best to approach it from an ex-ante perspective and think about the type of circumstances where finance would be likely to be additional. Yeah, so firstly, the shift into lower income and more challenging environments increases the likelihood that it's additional. Yeah. But secondly, there are quite few circumstances where it would have been possible for a company to get any form of money. Yeah? So Swedfund's investments might not be financially additional in the sense they could have got money from somewhere else, but it depends upon the terms of that money, that investment. So it could have, maybe they could have borrowed on very short-term, high interest rates from a local provider, and that would have undermined what they're trying to do, etc., etc., etc. So that's one thing. Secondly, as well as being additional in the sense of providing long-term patient capital in an environment where that's extremely scarce, Swedfund and other DFIs can bring other forms of additionality to bear in terms of management influence, employment rights and all that kind of thing. Yeah? So I wouldn't get, whilst the financial additionality point is crucial, people can get too hung up on it. I think, and it's also sort of impossible to disprove as well. But many environments, particularly complex, challenging environments, it's not as if there's a big wall of private money waiting to go in there that's being crowded out by Swedfund, I suspect, really. So, yeah, we took an ex-ante position on it, but then looked at things like the ESG impacts, and that would appear to be additional, but it's a different form of additionality. Can I just address quickly the point of your point about the investment climate is very important, yeah? And this was the slide when I was talking about cooperation or more cooperation with other agencies. That's exactly what I meant. To the extent that Swedfund is operating in challenging environments, the success or otherwise of a business isn't just dependent on what that business does. It's going to be strongly influenced by the climate in which it's operating. but Swedfund's not going and advising governments on regulation, but other people are. So cooperating with agencies that are trying to enhance the investment climate in parallel with making investments into those markets would strike me as very important.
I fully agree. And I think talking about the additionality, it's important to make sure that you actually invest in things where you make a difference, not necessarily in a bad business case that no one else wants to go after. That cannot be additionality then, and that's where you have to kind of draw the line. But if we start with the other question around the country mix, then I think that has changed over time. And if you look on the portfolio as such, you will see that there are investments, as you brought forward, for example, in Serbia or in Georgia and so on, that are not markets that we are active in today, and that changes over time. Then, we are a long-term investor, which means that we also always have a portion of the portfolio that kind of reflects an older strategy, and I think that is natural. I think it's good that there's a clarity in the strategy today that differentiates us. We are not necessarily being someone like EKN and SAK pushing for Swedish companies in certain countries, which I think was more of the older agenda of Swedfund. That's not the case today. That's not part of our agenda. We have a different mission today. When it comes to collaboration with other agencies, we work very closely with the other DFIs, so we meet on a very regular basis with the Nordic ones, and we will also later in May meet with all the European ones to discuss how we can also work together what we see as important things as DFIs to develop. Then, of course, we have a continuous and ongoing discussion with SIDA. SIDA is, of course, the one that is mainly contributing to the development of the structures in the different countries. And there is different activities in Sweden. Those are programs for extended aid or from aid to trade and so on. So there are different activities ongoing, and where Swedfund is, of course, an integrated part of that effort from a Swedish point of view to make sure that we contribute to the overall agenda. So that I think we are actually doing. If you look about the loans and the portfolio, I think there's two different questions. If you look at the hotels per se, we have investments in 2 hotels, and that is in Addis Ababa and Nairobi. Those are a little bit older investments. Those are not necessarily the ones we do with the current strategy. I think hotels are very good from the point of view of job creation. It gives us a good possibility to also impact the job conditions. And I think it's interesting, we have a case study on the hotel in Nairobi that actually shows that from an ESG and job condition point of view, it's actually one of our most successful investments. So talking about additionality, it actually depends on what you mean. I think hotels can be a very good way also as services are important. Now, what we talk about the current loan portfolio, what we're doing is what I talked about, more extending actually into small and mid-sized local corporations. Trying to target then agriculture, manufacturing, and so on, that we cannot necessarily invest in directly ourselves. So there is in history what we have done previously with the hotels, which I think are good investments from an additionality point of view, and what we are targeting with the loan portfolio going forward.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the questions, and thank you, Stephen, Maria, and Arne for being here and contributing to the discussion today. I must say that I have been in relation to various capacities to Swedfund almost since its foundation in '79, and I recognize, maybe with a smile, many of the questions and dilemmas that the organization face. But maybe my conclusion there would be that, well, questions remain, but answers change, because all the questions are still with us. The answers that we have now and that come from reports like Stevens and our research and knowledge are far better, but they don't solve the dilemmas that are here. And in a way, you can say these challenges of Swedfund is in the nature of dilemmas, and dilemmas don't have easy solutions. Problems have solutions, dilemmas don't, but one can keep discussing them. So thank you very much for taking part in this discussion. The next opportunity is far away, 28th of May, when there's the next EBA seminar, and the topic of that is the fluctuating value of aid. Should be interesting, and with good questions there too. We'll see about the answers when we meet. So welcome then, and thank you very much for being here today.